The attachment for this week, I sent it. Margaret didn't have it. She asked me for it again, and I sent it again. And neither of those emails showed up in her inbox, even though they show up in my sent box. I think sometimes that happens to you guys, and I hate to blame the interwebs, but that's what we're going to do. I had given Margaret my copy, so she's making, but they probably won't be here before the end of class. She's making copies for you. She brought me back my copy so I could teach you. And it'll be a wonderful exercise in listening with your, without a handout, listening with your eyes. I don't know what you want to call it. But I do apologize, and Margaret, of course, is mortified that it happened because she likes to serve you all well, and I know she does a good job of that. And like I said, I'm amazed in 7 or 8 years that I've been sending her the handouts. It hasn't happened before, and we'll pray it never happens again. But I am here. I'm prepared to teach you about the Phoenix. We're going to be out on time because today is the focus group that comes in. I planned my lesson knowing that we have a limited amount of time. And tomorrow is Ash Wednesday, and Lent will start. But I will not be back until the first Tuesday of March. I won't be here on the 28th, or whatever
That's right.
Yeah. Is today the 21st? Yeah. So, but I will be back, and I have a very, very exciting lesson plan for you. This is going to answer questions you didn't even know you had about the blood of Jesus. We are finally going to look together at what in the heck everybody means when they say saved by the blood and washed by the blood, and how the blood of Jesus operates. Not because those phrases are hard to understand, but because they raise questions for us, like, did Jesus have to die? And what does God need blood to be satisfied? All those little stirrings we're going to take up together. So I'm very excited about that. It'll be 4 weeks. It'll be the 4 Tuesdays in March, and information is forthcoming. Okay? So put on your seatbelts, get out your listening eyes, and we'll do our 4th in Birds of a Feather, and today is the Phoenix. And the Phoenix is a symbol of, first of all, resurrection, and secondarily, even in Christianity, hope that the future will be better. And I would tell you that resurrection itself stands for the possibility that the future will be better, because death has no power. There is victory over death, and therefore the future will be better. But over time, the Phoenix has also represented the delivery of Israelites from slavery. And again, that same concept of it looked terrible, but God had the final say. It's been a symbol for Christ's miraculous conception in Mary because of the way the Phoenix, which is fictional. I'm going to say that multiple times throughout our time together. There is no such thing as an actual phoenix. The phoenix is a mythological or mythical fictional bird. But in lore, the way the phoenix reproduces or regenerates out of the ashes has been compared to Mary having a virginal birthing experience. So some people think that the phoenix is a symbol for Christ's being conceived in Mary's womb, even though she was a virgin. The phoenix also in Christianity has represented fidelity. Fidelity is a trust word. There is an ancient Jewish tradition that Eve offered all the animals the forbidden fruit, not just Adam. And the phoenix in this ancient lore was the only one to refuse. And so because of that myth, the phoenix is known for its fidelity, its trustworthiness. It can be depended on by God. Then God granted the phoenix an unusual length of days. So there's that longevity associated with the phoenix. But what we're most familiar with and what we're taking up today is the phoenix as a symbol of the resurrection of Christ. So, like most of the birds we have studied together, the phoenix is not mentioned in the Bible, really. You can find old versions, old translations of the book of Job, and in Job 29:18, and you'll get your handout, and the verse will be repeated on that. But it says, "In my own nest I shall grow old, I shall multiply years like the phoenix." That's the only place that possibly phoenix appears in the Bible. Other translations, later, more recent translations, don't even use the word phoenix for that. But you can see that multiply years like the phoenix goes with the attribute of longevity that was attributed to the phoenix. So how did the use of the phoenix arise in Christianity? Well, first you have to know where it came from or where they found it. The phoenix is a mythical bird. By mythical, I mean it doesn't exist in reality. It is envisioned as a brightly arrayed, and it is known for its color. Phoenix, in fact, means red. It's known for its color, it's known for its beauty, it's known for its long life, which extends up to thousands of years, the legends go. It's also called a firebird. I think in Native American tradition, you hear about the firebird, and I think they are talking about the phoenix when they talk about the firebird. It was believed to burn itself to ashes and then resurrect again out of the ashes to a healthy and new life. As I said, the word phoenix means dark red or red, and it comes from an ancient Greek word that gets into our language as phoenix. Although the word phoenix is Greek, the myth of the phoenix actually goes back to the ancient Egyptians. They called this holy bird Bennu, B-E-N-U, and it was a heron that the Egyptians believed to have been the very first bird in the world. Now, I don't know how we got from heron to Bennu, but this holy bird called Bennu became the phoenix in the Greek language. In the old city of Heliopolis, which literally translates to city of the sun, Bennu symbolized the Egyptian sun god and or fire. So it's got this red color. It maybe had its roots in an actual heron, but we're way far away from the heron. Now we have this artistic, if you will, depiction of the bright or dark red phoenix, who legend has was the very first bird in the world, and it symbolizes the sun god and or fire. It was considered then as an expression of the divine. Now, these ancient Egyptians may not have had the vocabulary that we had, they may not have had the theology that we had, but they certainly were aware of divinity or this something beyond themselves. And so this phoenix came to represent the divine, and that divinity was associated with fire and the sun. And that makes sense. And closely related to those notions about the phoenix was how the sun, the actual star called the sun, dies every day and then rises again the following day. So even for the Egyptian mind, that was a symbol of an eternal cycle. That could have been a symbol. They may or may not have used the word resurrection, but something died and it came back, and it died and it came back, and this cycle was eternal. It has gone on according to the human mind for eternity. Now, they understood the sun to operate that way, but Bennu, this magical heron-like red bird that they made up, was said only to manifest himself once every 500 years. So you had to be really fortunate to catch Bennu, the phoenix. And here's what the legends have to say about the phoenix. The phoenix, first of all, fashions its own funeral. It does it with a fire, and it uses aromatic twigs and herbs, and they call it the funeral pyre, P-Y-R-E, funeral pyre, a little tent. The Boy Scouts learned how to make their fires like that, right? It all goes back to the Greek. The phoenix fashions its own funeral fire from aromatic twigs and herbs. Then it climbs on top of it, and the heat from the bird's own body is what ignites the fire or consumes the bird. So the phoenix is contributing to its own demise, which is death by fire. And what has remained is ashes. And then 3 days after its death, you like that? 3 days after its death, it rises again from the ashes. After the Egyptians and the Greeks, the ancient Romans also revered the phoenix. They saw it as a symbol, because this is how the ancient Romans viewed the world. The phoenix was a symbol of their glorious empire. It was enduring and immortal, just like the phoenix was the Roman Empire. In this Greco-Roman realm, the phoenix also symbolized the cycle of history, where time was divided into eras or periods. And as a sign of religious and political and social renewal, the phoenix was supposed to be reborn again after its own remains about every 500 years, but it later became 540 years. I can't explain that. But, so there you have the ancient world and its reverie for the phoenix, though the phoenix doesn't exist and is mythical. And we're not really troubled by that, because we had the pelican, who doesn't really strike her breast to feed her young, and yet is revered by Christians for that trait. So it's okay if they want to make up a bird. And with the rise of Christianity, the symbolism of the phoenix took on a new lease in life. It began to symbolize the immortal soul and Christ's resurrection. The earlier Christians, many of whom were Greek, saw in the phoenix an image of the resurrection. That was not a hard leap. If you had grown up with or was steeped in a culture that had the concept of the phoenix, and you understood that the lore associated with the phoenix, it makes sense that your brain would say, oh, we have a resurrected Christ. That's kind of like the phoenix. The phoenix dies and comes back to life. When it took on that connotation for Christianity, it became common to put phoenix depictions near burial places. And it became a favorite symbol of the early church. When you get your handout, you'll see I reproduced for you a Coptic Christian tombstone from about the 300s to the 700s. It's not really well dated. It's now in a museum in Amsterdam, but it's a fairly intact tombstone, if you will, or carving near a grave that has a phoenix on it. And that was for a Christian person associated with a Christian burial. Clement, maybe you've heard of Clement, he was a 1st century priest and bishop. He became the 4th pope. He also became Saint Clement of Rome, so if you know your saints. But he was around in the 1st century, and he wrote to the church in Corinth about the phoenix and its symbolic value. To me, it's remarkable that we have a writing from 1st century Christianity where somebody who went through the ranks as a priest and a bishop and a pope and a saint wrote about the value of the phoenix. And this is what he said: "Let us consider that wonderful sign of the resurrection which takes place in eastern lands, that is, in Arabia and the countries round about. There is a certain bird which is called a phoenix. This is the only one of its kind, and it lives 500 years. And when the time of its dissolution draws near, that it must die, it builds itself a nest of frankincense and myrrh and other spices, into which, when the time is fulfilled, it enters and dies, then later rises again. He goes on, do we then deem it any great and wonderful thing for the maker of all things to raise up again those that have piously served him in the assurance of a good faith, when even by a bird he shows us the mightiness of his power to fulfill his promise? So a couple of things went on in that writing. One is, as I read it, he believes there's an actual bird. He doesn't refer to a myth. He said, let us consider what takes place, and this is this bird, and this is what it does. Two is he uses that bird to say, if a bird can be resurrected or raised from the dead, certainly human beings can be resurrected and raised from the dead. And what occurs to me is two things. First of all, we have Lazarus in the Bible that is that foreshadowing where Jesus raises Lazarus. Now, you might argue Lazarus wasn't really dead or Lazarus was really just resuscitated, but the evidence in the Bible says he was dead and stinky and smelly. And Jesus used the power to raise him from the dead, and that's foreshadowing of Jesus being raised from the dead. So I don't think we need evidence that God has the power to raise mortal human beings from the dead. But this Pope thought this was a remarkable example or object lesson in that regard. And we also have Jesus. So if the resurrection of the human Lazarus is a foreshadowing, we have the resurrection of the human body of Jesus as an example of what God can do. So I don't know why the Pope Clement thought we needed a phoenix. This is my commentary. A century after Clement wrote, another church father, who you might have also heard of, Tertullian, he again used the example of the phoenix in connection with the resurrection. And then the story of the phoenix was featured in some writing that I mentioned way back the first week we got together, the Physiologus. And that was a Greek work that described real and mythical animals and outlined their allegorical significance for the developing body of Christian theology. Okay, so they picked this up from Clement. Clement has picked it up from the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, and they carry it forward. Writing a little later, Origen, another church father, spoke of the phoenix as an example of the variety and harmony to be found in God's creation. In the 4th and 5th centuries, church fathers were repeating the myth, even offering the mythical bird as God-given proof of the reality of Christ's resurrection. In the words of this church father, Cyril, God knew men's unbelief and provided for this purpose a bird called a phoenix. I would say God knew humans' unbelief and provided for this purpose a son called Jesus. Around the 6th century, another preacher wrote a sermon in which he claimed the phoenix had been first seen at the time of Cain and Abel, and that it was last seen just after Jesus' birth, which now indicates to us the resurrection. I'm not sure I follow the logic. What I want you to know is people are still talking about this. They're talking about it in writing, which, as we know from studying history, it's fairly significant to get written texts from so long ago on any topic. Christian writers then began to read more and more into references to the phoenix. They noted its uniqueness. There's only one of its kind. And they began to interpret the phoenix of pagan myth, not only as a symbol of Christianity and of virgin birth and of renovation and resurrection, but as an allegory of Jesus Christ himself. And I want to put a little exclamation point on that, because all these other birds, I think the people who have used them throughout history, they understand this is a bird, this is a sign, this is pointing us to something, the greater reality. This is a basic reality that points to a greater reality of Jesus. I think what's happening surrounding the use of the phoenix and the mythology of the phoenix is they're beginning to say that the phoenix is akin to Christ. And I just ask you to pay attention to that and what I've reproduced for you and what I'm saying to you. And you can make up your own mind about it. But I do see something a little bit distinctive in the way history was using and interpreting the phoenix. Early Christians' ability to, quote, preserve ancient conceptions deeply rooted in classical culture, adapting them to their new experience and faith in life, unquote, is not surprising. That's what we do. I read to you last week about how we got Valentine's Day. We went all the way back to this ancient festival. We picked up a beheaded saint, and we put the ancient festival together, and boom, we have St. Valentine's Day. So it's not surprising that they look to the past and they take pagan traditions and they kind of imbue them with Christian meaning. Members of the dominant Christian sect, based in Rome at the time, would have been eager, I think, and others agree, to find common ground not only with their own roots but with the pagan masses that they hoped to convert. Imagine you are an ancient Greek or Roman person and you're trying to bear witness to Christ and his resurrection. Maybe you know they have a phoenix in their house and you sit down and you go, hey, I see you have a phoenix. You know how the phoenix dies on its own ashes and comes back to life? That's what Christ did. So you can see how that makes sense. But some argue that the adaptation of the phoenix myth was a rewriting of the Christ story into pagan terminology, a practice known as syncretism. Have you heard that word? Syncretism is a bad sin from the Old Testament. You'll see what it's spelled like. You'll see it on their handout. And I even, I put a little cautionary note here, and I'll read it to you. It says, one could make this argument in a syncretism about other symbols as well, but it didn't come up in my research of the other birds. Only the phoenix in my 4 birds made reference to perhaps they've gone too far. And so syncretism is the reconciliation or fusion of differing systems of belief. SYNC, in sync, things go together. And syncretism is when you take this and you take this and you fuse them together, and you could say, well, that's just what they did with Valentine's Day. Well, I will say this. The fusion that is syncretic, has syncretism in it, results in a new teaching or new belief that is neither one nor the other. So think mutation. Think the properties of this and the properties of this, and there's this third thing that comes out of it that is neither. And from the time of the Old Testament, this practice cannot be reconciled to the monotheistic principles of Judaism, and it can't be reconciled to Christianity from a biblical perspective. So I'm just describing for you what it is to have syncretism, and I'm telling you that in none of my research on any of the other birds did anybody suggest there was syncretism going on. It only came up with the phoenix. So pay attention to that. It is possible to see the mythical phoenix as a way to understand and explain resurrection without committing the sin of syncretism. I believe that. However, because the mythical bird has so many connotations for other religions, the symbol of the phoenix teeters on the edge of being a problem. You don't have to agree. I'm just trying to point that out to you. Christians are to venerate Christ alone. Seeing the phoenix as pointing to Christ becomes a problem if the phoenix or its attributes are venerated rather than Jesus being venerated. So that's the line and the slippery slope. Now, the phoenix is found throughout Christian art and throughout history, especially during the medieval period, and it remains a beautiful symbol that still captures the fascination of the modern world. And I've included for you a phoenix rising from the ashes in a book from the 1700s. Now what I want to do is compare these two origin stories of the phoenix, one from India and one from Arabia. We'll see where that gets us. We'll look at the bestiary and we'll say, what does it tell us about ancient Christianity and what does it have to teach us for modern Christianity? So, two origin stories of the phoenix. The first is that it's a bird that lives in India, and when it reaches 500 years, it flies to a frankincense tree. And see how these emblems that are important to our Christian faith are woven into these stories. And it fills its wing with spices. In early spring, a priest at the Heliopolis covers an altar with twigs. The phoenix comes to the city, sees the altar, lights a fire there, and is consumed by it. The next day, a small, sweet-smelling worm is found in the ashes. On the second day, the worm has transformed into a small bird, and on the third, the form of the phoenix is apparent. The bird then returns to its original place of origin. So that's India. The phoenix is a purple or red bird that lives in Arabia, the second origin story goes. There is only one living phoenix in the world at any time. When it is old, it builds a pyre of wood and spices and climbs onto it. There it faces the sun and the fire ignites. It fans the fire with its wings until it is completely consumed. Some say it is the sun that ignites the fire. Others say that it is the phoenix that starts it. A new phoenix rises from the ash of the old. So I can see in both of those origin stories, the one from India and the one from Arabia, attributes that are attractive to Christian people as they want to understand or explain what happens in the resurrection of Christ. I also can say the resurrection of Christ is a mystery beyond my understanding. I can absolutely believe that Christ was died and buried and entombed, and on the third day he rose under the power of God that I do not understand. I don't need the phoenix or the ashes or the fact that a phoenix can do it, but you can see how the nest of frankincense and the participation in its own death, it's not just passive, but Jesus had these teachings and Jesus goes willingly and all those kinds of things. Anyway, to these origin stories, the bestiary that we've looked at before, the Aberdeen bestiary, says, the phoenix can also signify the resurrection of the righteous, gathering the aromatic plants of virtue, prepare for the renewal of their former energy after death. Faith in the resurrection to come is no more of a miracle than the resurrection of the phoenix from its ashes. You got to be careful if you're going to say that. You hear what I'm saying? Resurrection to come. That's the resurrection of humanity in the last days and the way that we believe we are resurrected after death. This says is not a miracle because the phoenix does it with physical explanation, so we don't have a miracle, a sign act from God. The bestiary goes on. See how the nature of the bird offers to ordinary people proof of the resurrection, that what the scripture proclaims, the working of nature confirms. And I think that might be backwards. This is printed for you. You can look at it. You can circle it. You can write question marks. You can write, I like to write when I'm thinking about something. But you can decide for yourself what kind of line this kind of thinking is transgressing. Or not. You can say, okay, that's what they believed. Or you can say, whoa, danger, Will Robinson. I did reproduce for you the phoenix from the Aberdeen bestiary. I also reproduced for you a stained glass window in a church depicting a phoenix. It has the phoenix and Jesus and St. Peter and a missionary, and it's in Belgium. And you can see, he's right up there with Jesus and St. Peter. It's like a new trinity. What does the phoenix symbol tell us about ancient Christianity? Well, first, and we know this already, but it's worth repeating, early Christians learned and borrowed from other cultures and religions. That's not a new insight for us, but it is confirmed that this was Christian behavior. Look around in the world and say, what can I find that makes sense to me, that can help explain what my faith is teaching me? And then I even put in my observation here, but see my notes on syncretism, because there's a fine line. The early church, we know, looked for ways to illustrate and to make plain certain concepts about God and Jesus, like the resurrection. And the resurrection is central to Christianity. We know that, but we know that they also knew that because we see how earnestly they tried to and found symbols for depicting it and explaining it and passing on these attributes. Resurrection and new life were so central to the early church's identity that believers looked for and found ways to explain what was happening using the language and images of the world around them to articulate these beliefs. And I think it's helpful to know that. I think that makes me kind of nod my head about ancient Christianity, maybe what it was like to be a Christian in ancient times. But I'm still looking for ways that it is meaningful in our faith today. And to get there, I like to look at how has the Christian meaning of the phoenix been used outside of the church. So apart from the tombs of ancient Christians, apart from the stained glass windows, what is the phoenix doing in the world under a Christian umbrella, if you will? There's a poem from 9th century. It's called an Anglo-Saxon poem. It is 677 lines. It was anonymously written. It has been preserved from the 9th century in a codex of Old English poetry called the Exeter Book. So it exists, this 677 line poem. You can look it up on the internet and find a modern translation of it. Some scholars believe that it was adapted from a Latin poem, and others believe it is a loose translation of a different Latin poem that links the mythic properties of the phoenix to Christianity. So what we have is, in literature, a fairly detailed and intact written description linking the phoenix and Christianity. Part of the poem appears based on scripture, mostly from that one line that I read to you from Job. And it does have references to the New Testament and to Revelation, though phoenix doesn't appear there. This poem alludes to those Bible verses. Reportedly, the second half of the poem is a long allegory drawing parallels between the phoenix's immortal properties and those same qualities in Jesus. And I did produce for you a little excerpt. I won't read the whole thing to you. I'll just note that it starts with, "The phoenix is in the middle, encircled by a throng. The people gaze upon him, looking at him in wonder, how that joyous band worthies the wild one throng after another, proclaiming craftily and adoring him for their king, the most loved of chiefs, led among delights, the noble to his home, until the solitary bird flies away, swift of feathers, so that he cannot be followed by them, the exultant multitude, when the joy of the many seeks his homeland from the ground of this earth." Very quickly, reference to that solitariness of the bird has made people think, oh, he's solitary like Christ was solitary. These things might not be obvious to you and me, but this is what the 9th century world was working with. And they thought it came from one or two different Latin poems. It got translated into Anglo-Saxon. It's been preserved. It's held up as an allegory. And I mentioned also to you before this book called Four Birds of Noah's Ark by Thomas Dekker. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare. One of his four birds, Phoenix makes the top four, even though it's not really a bird. Phoenix makes his top four list. And that book, The Four Birds of Noah's Ark, is a prayer instruction guide. And so this is what he has to say. "The fourth and last bird which you are to behold, flying out of Noah's Ark, is the phoenix. The phoenix of all other birds lives to the longest age. so must our prayers fly up in the bright flames all the days of our life. We must be petitioners even to the hour and the last minute of our breath. The phoenix has the best feathers in the world, and prayers are to be the most beautiful wings by which we mount into heaven. There is but one phoenix upon the earth, as there is but one tune in which God delights, and that is the prayer of a sinner. So he kind of takes it, he's not talking about the phoenix as a resurrection, he's talking about how our prayers should be as long-living, enduring, lengthy, beautiful, and speak to God in such a way as the phoenix is so distinct and beautiful. There's more. It goes on to repeat the lore about the nest and the sun and all that sort of stuff. Even William Shakespeare wrote about the phoenix. It was an untitled poem. It featured the phoenix and the turtle dove. Sometimes they called the turtle dove just a turtle, so it would be hard for me to recognize that as a bird. But according to the scholars, this poem by Shakespeare laments the death and recounts the funeral rites for both the phoenix and the turtle dove, and they are to have exemplified a perfect union of love, beginning with a gathering of mourners, and it concludes with a lamentation, and that's where they picked up William Shakespeare's name associated with that poem. And then, in 1952, The Sect of the Phoenix was written by an Argentinian writer and described, it was a story, it described a fictional sect. What would we call that? Maybe a cult, whose members are found all over the world. They have no holy book. They belong to various ethnicities. Their cult has just one rite, and that is the way they pass the mysterious secret to other people. The author doesn't reveal what his secret is in the story itself. I'm not even going to read the story because that's disappointing. But he later responds to requests from readers and states that the secret for passing the cult attributes on to the next generation is procreation. They have babies. I tell you this just because I want you to know in 1952, the mystery of the phoenix was alive and well. More recently, you might know the Harry Potter series. Author J.K. Rowling used the phoenix as a central symbol in her stories. Harry Potter series has drawn controversy, not about the phoenix, but about, Christian community overall has been a little bit suspicious of the Harry Potter series. But Rowling could have used the phoenix as a Christian symbol of purification and resurrection, even if the phoenix also symbolizes other things. So it didn't have to be Christianity, or it could have been Christianity. It's literature. So, how does the phoenix inform our faith today? The image of a mythical bird that bursts into flames and then rises from the ashes has no doubt captured everybody's imagination from the beginning of time and for thousands of years. Associated with rebirth, healing, creation, resurrection, new beginnings, the phoenix will likely live on in our culture. In fact, I included some popular quotes for you. I'm not going to read them, but I'll read one of them to you. Khalil Gibran. And let it direct your passion with reason, that your passion may live through its own daily resurrection, and like the phoenix, rise above its own ashes. So the phoenix is alive and well. I've put about 8, maybe 6 quotes for you. And I believe the phoenix can always remind us of resurrection and new life. I believe a tulip bud can remind us of the resurrection and new life. I don't have to look far because the resurrection is important to me and it's always on my mind. But there are other symbols that do the same job. We have the peacock, we have the butterfly, and I am suggesting to you, maybe those are better symbols for Christian people than the phoenix. I'm suggesting maybe let other people use the phoenix, and as Christians, we grab onto some other symbols. It's okay if you love the phoenix and have your whole house decorated in phoenixes, even though there's really only one. But these other symbols that I'm suggesting, like the butterfly or even the pelican, even though she got misappropriated in a certain way. They appear in nature, they're not fictional. And I would put my stock maybe in those more so than the fictional one. A peacock is real, a butterfly is real. The worm that comes, the caterpillar that becomes a butterfly, that is a biological process. The phoenix is mythical, and the process of dying and coming back to life is all fantasy and fiction. And not that that can't be helpful, but for me, I think I would rely on other symbols. Like if I were making a banner at church or gonna buy a pillow in my house to show I was a Christian, I think I would choose the peacock instead of the phoenix. That's just me. And I also think for the other birds that we've talked about and the other symbols like the butterfly available to us, the meaning attached to them is not so freighted or weighed down with all these other cultural meanings. So I end where I started with our bird series, that any way that we can think of or use to talk about God is always going to be metaphorical or symbolic. That's the language available to us to talk about what is otherwise indescribable, or to use a fancy vocabulary word, ineffable. God is truly indescribable, cannot be fully comprehended by our human minds, and we will always use symbols and metaphors, and I say keep doing it. But if we want to keep the phoenix as a metaphor for something about God, I think it would be important to use like or as, always, to be clear that you're making a comparison. And so, for example, maybe you would say, Jesus rose from the dead. That's a fact. Jesus rose from the dead. Like a phoenix, mythical though he is, rising from the ashes. That like, I think, is an important link to using metaphor. Or we place our hope in God because God's power is indestructible, like a phoenix is indestructible. So that to me would be the appropriate use of a symbol like the phoenix, given its freighted or weighted connotations. That is all I have for you on the phoenix and on I have thoroughly enjoyed our tour through the birds, and it always helps me to think about Jesus and God and the resurrection and all that it means for me, and I hope it's been good for you too. Thank you.